Hello everyone and welcome back to our daily quiz series, and I am focusing on general physiology and muscle physiology today. Now let's take the first question. Now there are so many requests to take on this topic of preloaded and afterloaded muscles. So let's have a look at this. Now this says, which of the following is shorter in a preloaded muscle as compared to an afterloaded muscle? Now there is a latent period, contraction, relaxation period, and height of contraction. So let's first understand what is a preloaded state and what is an afterloaded state. Now let me try and draw this experimental setup where we have dissected a muscle from an experimental animal, maintained it under laboratory conditions, and this muscle is now hanging here with the weight attached to it. This muscle is at rest. That means now the weight is acting on the muscle at rest, and it increases the length of the muscle. It stretches the muscle. Right? Let us take another. Now it's the same muscle, same load, but a little different in the sense that now the muscle is hanging, the load is attached to it. But as you can see, this load is now resting on a platform or on a table. The muscle is at rest. So that means this load is not acting on the muscle at rest. When will this load start acting on the muscle? When the muscle begins to contract. That means it has to now lift that load. So the first one is called a preloaded state. Preloaded. The load is acting on the muscle even before it begins to contract. This is what is known as the afterloaded state. What is afterloaded state? Now the load will act on the muscle after it begins to contract. In other words, the muscle has to act against that load. Now, I will give a stimulus to the muscle, to both these muscles. The muscles will contract and lift that load. Both the muscles will contract and lift that load. Now, this is the contracted state of the muscle. Now I'm going to compare the two types of muscle contractions. So one will be a preloaded muscle contraction and the other one will be a afterloaded muscle contraction. So in the preloaded muscle contraction, let's try and see. I've given the stimulus here. After a very short latent period. What is latent period? Latent period is the time taken or the time period between the stimulus and the onset of muscle contraction. A brief latent period, the muscle begins to contract and then the muscle will relax. So this is what is known as a simple muscle twitch. The muscle contraction following a single stimulus. So I recorded the muscle twitch in the preloaded state and in the afterloaded state. Now, in the preloaded state, we find that the latent period, so if I look at the preloaded and the afterloaded state, this is the muscle contraction. The one in red is the preloaded state. A graph is for preloaded and the B1 is for afterloaded state. So what do you see over here is, in the preloaded state, the latent period is shorter, contraction period is longer, relaxation period is longer, and the height of contraction is more. Right? This is my preloaded state, a more efficient contraction, and this is the afterloaded muscle contraction. Right? What has increased the efficiency in the preloaded state? The increase in the length of the muscle, the stretch of the muscle. Now, what has happened is when you increase the length of the muscle, now there is more distance for the myosin head to slide over the actin. That is what makes it more efficient. Right? So So going back to my question here, the latent period is shorter in preloaded state. Contraction period is more. Relaxation period is more. The height of contraction is more. The work done will be more in the preloaded state as compared to the afterloaded state. What happens in the afterload? Longer latent period, shorter contraction period, shorter relaxation period, less height of contraction, less work done. So the answer to this becomes the latent period. Now let's try and see this. What would be a preloaded state? Supposing you are in the gym, you have, let's say, 2 dumbbells, each of 10 kg weight maybe, and you're standing with the dumbbells hanging on the side. Then your biceps is in a preloaded state. Yes, it is stretching the biceps, and then when you do your biceps curls, these will be more efficient. Right? In the gym, the trainer will make you do more preloaded muscle contractions. What would be an afterloaded muscle contraction in the gym? Let's say the weights are lying on the ground and you lift them. Right? That means your muscles are now working against that weight. It is not acting. That weight is not acting in the resting state. If it is lying on the ground and you lift them up like that, that will be an afterloaded state. Even when you look at weightlifters, when they're trying to lift a very heavy weight, initially they will pick up the weight from the ground, let it hang for some time. They increase the length of the biceps, bringing it to a preloaded state, and then they contract and lift it above their heads. Have you understood? That just increases the efficiency and makes it a more effective muscle contraction. Let's have a look at the second question. All of the following are true regarding the resting length. Now, what is resting length? Resting length is also known as the optimum length. Now, what is optimum length? In optimum length, now during an isometric muscle contraction, there is something known as the length-tension relationship or the Frank-Starling's law. What is length-tension relationship? In the length-tension relationship, we take the initial length of the muscle on the x-axis. What is initial length? It is the length of the muscle before it begins to contract. And we take the tension generated on the y-axis. Now, what is the Frank-Starling's law or the length-tension relationship? More the initial length, more is the tension, but more is the tension generated, but up to a physiological limit beyond which further increase in initial length decreases the tension generated. Now, this is what is known as your Tmax, maximum tension. And this is the optimum length, also known as the resting length. What is optimum length? Definition. Optimum length is that initial length at which, if a muscle contracts isometrically, the tension generated will be maximum. So at optimum length, there are maximum number of actin-myosin cross bridges. Absolutely true. Resting length is, or the optimum length corresponds to a sarcomere length of 2 to 2.2 microns. When the sarcomere length is between 2 and 2.2 microns and the muscle contracts isometrically, the tension generated is maximum. Total and active tension generated is maximum. This is true. Passive tension is maximum. This is a false statement. Let me try and explain what is passive tension, total tension, and active tension. Like I said, this Frank-Starling's law or length-tension relationship is applicable to a isometric muscle contraction. So how do we get this graph is, we have an experimental setup, we've got a muscle which has been dissected, we are maintaining it under laboratory conditions, right? Now, this is the muscle here. We take the initial length of the muscle, we measure the initial length, fix the initial length, right? Let's say it is 5 centimeters, just arbitrary. Length is fixed. Now give a stimulus to the muscle. Sorry, before you give a stimulus to the muscle, when the muscle is at rest, measure the tension in the muscle. That is called passive tension. Tension at rest because of the stretch. Now give a stimulus to the muscle. Muscle will contract isometrically. There is tension generated. Now that will be known as the total tension. So we will now measure two parameters at this length. One was passive tension before it began to contract, and the other is the total tension. Total tension includes the passive tension. That means at length 5 centimeters, the passive tension, let's say, was almost 0. Yes. So let's say over here, and the total tension generated is this much. Right? We've got tension generated, tension on the y-axis. Let's take another example. Now the muscle, we stop giving a stimulus to the muscle. Muscle contracts, muscle relaxes. Now we stretch the muscle. We increase the length of the muscle from, let's say, 5 to 7 centimeters. So now and we fix the length of the muscle. So now the initial length is 7 centimeters. Now, because of the stretch, the tension generated is called passive tension. We measure that. That will be slightly more. Now we give a stimulus to the muscle. Muscle will contract. Now the tension generated in the muscle will be called total tension. It includes the passive tension and the tension generated due to the isometric muscle contraction. So total tension was this much. Right? Again, the muscle, we stop giving a stimulus to the muscle. Muscle relaxes. Now we again stretch the muscle. Increase the initial length. Let's say we take it to 9 centimeters. Now, because of the stretch, so this was, let's say, 5, 7, 9. Because of the stretch, the tension generated is passive tension. We give a stimulus to the muscle. Muscle will contract isometrically at length 9 centimeters. That is known as total tension. So we've got these. We keep on increasing the initial length of the muscle and recording the passive tension and making the muscle contract isometrically at that length and recording the total tension. Right? So this is the graph that we get. This is known as the passive tension due to the stretch. And this is a graph of total tension. Right? Now there is a third term called active tension. What is active tension? Active tension means I want to know how much is the tension generated only due to the muscle contraction. So active tension will be total tension minus the passive tension. So the graph will be something like this. Now comes the concept of optimum length. This is the maximum tension, Tmax. The initial length at which the tension generated is maximum is known as the optimum length, also known as the resting length. So at optimum length, total and active tension generated is maximum, but passive tension will continue to increase even beyond optimum length. Right? So hopefully you've understood the difference between the three terms. Passive tension due to the stretch. When the muscle contracts isometrically, the tension which is recorded is total tension, which includes passive tension. If I want active tension, that means tension only due to muscle contraction, I will subtract passive tension from the total tension. So going back to this question now, passive tension as maximum is an incorrect statement. Total and active tension generated at optimum length or resting length is maximum. That is a true statement. Let's have a look at the next question. If the average hydrostatic pressure in the glomerular capillaries is 50 millimeters of mercury and the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman's capsule is 12 and average colloid osmotic pressure in the glomerular capillaries is 30. So the A force which favors filtration is the glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure. What opposes filtration is the glomerular capillary colloid osmotic pressure. The Bowman's capsule hydrostatic pressure also opposes filtration, and favoring filtration is the Bowman's capsule colloid osmotic pressure. In other words, what is net pressure? This is PGC minus pi GC. Why minus pi GC? Because pi GC, or the colloid osmotic pressure of the glomerular capillaries, opposes filtration. Minus PBC, which is also opposing filtration, plus pi GC. Now, how much is hydrostatic pressure in the glomerular capillaries? 50. Colloid osmotic pressure in the glomerular capillaries is 30. Hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman's capsule is 12. No proteins in the filtrate means the colloid osmotic pressure of this should be colloid osmotic pressure of the Bowman's capsule. That is going to be 0. So once again, what is the net pressure? PGC minus pi GC minus PBC plus pi BC. PGC is 50, pi GC is 30, PBC is 12, and pi BC is 0 because there are no proteins in the filtrate. This gives me a net pressure of 8 millimeters of mercury. Once again, what is the net pressure? This is hydrostatic pressure of the glomerular capillaries minus the colloid osmotic pressure of the glomerular capillaries minus the hydrostatic pressure of the Bowman's capsule plus the colloid osmotic pressure in the Bowman's capsule. And remember, GFR is directly proportional to this net pressure. Gibbs-Donnan equilibrium is based on which of the following? Now, for Gibbs-Donnan equilibrium, when there are two compartments X and Y separated by a semi-permeable membrane, with the presence of impermeant anions on one side of the semi-permeable membrane. What are proteins? Proteins are your impermeant anions. Impermeant means they cannot cross the cell membrane. So once again, Gibbs-Donnan equilibrium will be seen in whenever there are two compartments separated by a semi-permeable membrane with impermeant anions on one side of the semi-permeable membrane. Like for instance, this will be ICF and ECF. ICF and ECF are separated by a semi-permeable membrane, and you have proteins which are negatively charged in the ICF. Now, this affects the distribution of diffusible ions. This affects the distribution of a pair of diffusible ions. What are diffusible ions? Which can cross the cell membrane, right? So let's see, what is this Gibbs-Donnan equilibrium? Just for the sake of explanation, imagine that potassium is equal on both sides. Potassium is diffusible. It can move across the cell membrane. Now, these negatively charged proteins will attract the positively charged potassium so that at equilibrium, there is more potassium in X as compared to Y. And similarly for chloride, chloride is a negatively charged ion, so proteins will repel chloride. So there will be more chloride in Y as compared to X. This is Gibbs-Donnan equilibrium. There are two things which are required for this Gibbs-Donnan effect or Gibbs-Donnan equilibrium. Number one, presence of a semi-permeable membrane, and number two, impermeant anions on one side of the semi-permeable membrane. And what does it result in? It results in an unequal distribution of a pair of diffusible ions. At equilibrium. So, answer to this question becomes very easy. It is going to be intracellular proteins. Which of the following is used to calculate the tetanizing frequency? Now, what is tetanizing? What is tetanus? Tetanus is a state of sustained contraction. It is different from tetany. We discussed hypocalcemic tetany yesterday. This is tetanus. For example, when you are making your notes, your small muscles of the hand are in a state of sustained contraction. They're in a state of physiological tetanus. How is a muscle, for example, I'm sitting, my paraspinal muscles are in a state of physiological tetanus. How does a muscle go into a state of physiological tetanus? When it gets repeated stimuli from the cortex, from the motor cortex. So how do we calculate the tetanizing frequency? This is going to be 1 upon the contraction period in seconds. Now, for example, we've given a stimulus to the muscle. Let's say the latent period is 10 milliseconds. Muscle begins to contract. The contraction period, let's say, is 40 milliseconds. And then the muscle relaxes. And let's say that the relaxation period is 50 milliseconds. Contract the tetanizing frequency. Tetanizing frequency will be 1 upon the contraction period in seconds. So this is 1 upon 40 upon 1000 second, because millisecond is 1000th of a second. So this will be 1000 divided by 40, which is going to be 25 per second, or 25 hertz. This is how you will calculate the tetanizing frequency.